Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David, your host of the Authentic Man podcast, back for another episode. And this episode is quite a journey, because we started off with one topic being the main topic, and that was to talk about intimacy, pre-pregnancy, pregnancy, during pregnancy, and post-pregnancy, after childbirth. And it actually turned into something a lot more important, a lot more vulnerable, a lot more open, a lot more honest. And the episode is with Cam Fraser, a sexologist and sex coach in Australia. I was going to say the US, but he's definitely in Australia. And we really got into talking about his experience of pregnancy, and then his experience of childbirth, what that was like for him and his partner Edwina, which is quite a story in itself. Getting there is quite a story in itself. And yeah, I feel really blessed to just have held the space for him to talk. I felt like a story that needed to be told and just kind of came out in the episode. And yeah, I think this is such a great listen for anyone who is thinking about having children. Maybe their partner's currently pregnant, or you've just had a baby, as a man or woman, to kind of understand a man's point of view. I think there's a lot said by women about how beautiful childbirth is for them and how beautiful pregnancy is for them. But there's not so much said by men about the experience, because I think it's often assumed that, as a man, you're not pregnant. So, what you're doing, you're just doing nothing. But in this episode, Cam really goes into what it was like for him, with his partner, being a man, being during the childbirth and labor, especially in his role in labor. What did he do? What was his, I don't want to say his tasks and so forth, but the things he was doing. He wasn't just sitting there doing nothing, as you'll hear. But also how the sort of archetypes he was embodying during pregnancy and afterwards, and his experience with his little boy, Fergus, who's a little bit older now. Great seeing him on Instagram. Looks like he's having fun, getting on the great outdoors. And I will let you know that Cam Fraser has a couple of courses he's running at the moment, and one that the ladies will be very much interested in is Man Myths, which is basically guiding women through the various myths and truths about men and how men relate and, sexuality and so forth. So a very interesting one there for you to have a look into. And yeah, we talk about all things. We start off actually by talking about, his journey to being a sexologist and sex coach, which is really interesting because he talks about his time in America, and masculinity there, and how he was being portrayed as a man there, and how that came to his, what I would probably call a bit of a awakening and eye-opening through various events. And obviously we talk in the episode about intimacy during and after pregnancy, and being in certain archetypes, and the reverence that we held for pregnant women as well. It's really beautiful to hear Cam's experience there. And also, what is it like post-childbirth? What's sex like post-childbirth? That's a very interesting part. He talks about that and what's been like for him and some of the clients that he's worked with. So it's a great episode. I've just listened to it. I always edit my episodes, so I get to re-listen to them and enjoy them. And it's just incredibly educational. And, I love listening to Cam speak and interacting with his content on Instagram as well. You can find all the links to what I was talking about in the show notes as well. And I guess for me, what do I have coming up? I have, I have a workshop coming up on Thursday, the 30th, of September. That's a tantric foreplay run by me and my partner, Orsa. And I have another workshop that is called Creating the Spark, which is on the 6th of October. I moved that back a little while ago, and that's all about kind of creating the spark in our dating lives. That's a men's only workshop, as often many of mine are, but not all of my workshops are. But looking forward to hearing, I think I say at the end of the episode, but, get in contact and let us know what you think of the episode, what you learned, how your eyes were opened, or, what your experience maybe of intimacy and childbirth and pregnancy were, especially the guys, and really, want to hear more about this. Is something that I can see myself moving into and experiencing in the next few years coming. So yeah, really, really interested for you to get into this. So I won't yabber on too much. I'll let you get into it and enjoy the episode. So welcome listeners, back on another new episode. And I've this week's episode with a man who I've really looked up to. I've really looked up to his work, and I've been following his work for probably 2 years or so. And I really love his approach to connecting with men through intimacy and sex, but in a way that speaks the language of logic, that speaks the language of research and understanding and past history and lineage. So there's always a case, when I interact with what he writes about, it's like, oh wow, there's not just his opinion. This is opinions from 4, 5, 6 different studies that have happened over the last 5 or 10 years. And I think in the space of sex and intimacy, often we just speak from our own experience, which I know I'm definitely guilty of, but this is one of the reasons I really love this guy's work. I'd like to welcome Cam Fraser.
Hey man, thanks so much for having me, and thank you for that really lovely introduction. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good, man. I was just telling you before we jumped on that I'm feeling pretty raw. I've been in a bit of an emotional process the last kind of 24, 48 hours, just around fatherhood and my relationship, and not only my relationship with my lovely partner, but my relationship with my son as well. So yeah, just feeling a bit, I'm just feeling a bit vulnerable, a bit emotional, but happy to show up in that with full integrity and speak into it as much as I can.
Oh, thank you for being here. I know it's sometimes when we're in these states, it's hard to want to show up and talk about like what might feel like work and so forth.
Yeah, no, I want to talk more about this part of my life and part of my journey, because I don't really see a lot of fellas talking about fatherhood or their experiences with like the vulnerability that comes from stepping into that part of their life. And so I want to use the little platform that I have to bring a little bit more awareness to it, and maybe be a bit of a torchbearer for some other guys who might be feeling similarly, and hopefully they resonate with what I've got to share. So yeah, more than happy to speak into it.
Yeah. And for the listeners to see what Cam does from, maybe I'm going to get something wrong here, but, from my experience, Cam is a sexologist and a leading sexologist in Australia. He's the go-to man from what I see, and also from what I have experienced in Oz as someone to go to about sex and men, but also is a sex coach. And he also really puts out beautiful content on Instagram, which is well thought out, which is connected to lineage. And I think one of the things that really stuck out to you, that's not necessarily part of your work, is the respect that you have for the land that you live on in Australia and that you inhabit, and the history of this land. It's something I've really seen that I really love, that you pay homage to the people of the land, the beginning of your
Thanks,
podcast, man, and throughout your work.
Yeah, it's been something that I haven't always done, and I just as I've kind of learned more about, I suppose, the like First Nations and Aboriginal people here in Australia. I've tried to do a little bit more, just be a bit more mindful about it. I suppose that's all I really can do as a white fella here in Australia. So it's been, it's definitely been something that I'm still learning about and still wanting to bring a little bit more awareness to, again, using the kind of small platform that I have to at least try and bring a bit more, I'm really interested in like masculinity with regards to like intersectionality as well. So something that I'm trying to learn more about is like Aboriginal masculinity and sexuality, and maybe the stories around men and sex from that kind of First Nations point of view as well. Just because I think there's so much value in learning about masculinity and sexuality from different cultures and from different traditions. So it's definitely something I'm just trying to be mindful of, man, and do my best, and fully admit that I don't really know what I'm doing most of the time. But I try and be honest about that as well. And I'll probably continue to get things wrong. But yeah, just showing up as much as possible with just from a place of compassion, man. I think that's like the biggest thing that I try and bring into the work, even though I do reference like a lot of academic material and journal articles and things like that. I really try and, well, as much as possible, try and bring in some compassion for what it is that I'm talking about, because it's usually quite close to home. What it is that I like, why I share it, and kind of where that sharing is coming from comes from a place of like it being really relevant to my own life. So yeah, I appreciate you acknowledging that, man, and recognizing it. And it's something that just all I can say is just being mindful of as well. I think it's really important to be mindful of.
But the compassion really comes through. I really feel the compassion, and the passion as well. I feel both of those. So I'm going to start with the question I ask all my guests. Is how did you come to do the work that you do today? What was the journey that brought you there?
This is a long story in its fullest extent, so I will try and boil it down into a couple of key points, and those points being really pertinent to like what it is that I do today. The first kind of big light bulb moment for me with regards to doing this work was my own experiences as a young man, I suppose. I went and studied over in America. I went to university from Australia over to America, and I studied psychology and philosophy over there. And I was an Australian in America, and I don't know, people that are listening might know this, but for some reason Americans love Australians. So I went over there, and I was very well received as a young man from Australia, which presented a lot of opportunities for sexual experiences, I'll say. But the mindset that I had, because of my I guess upbringing and my mentality at the time as a young dude, playing sport as well as a collegiate athlete, my mentality around sex at the time was very quantity over quality. And so, I was part of this locker room culture as well, like literal locker room. I went to a locker room to get changed to play sport. And so, being a guy in one of those spaces, like, I mean, the conversations and the language is pretty misogynistic in those locker rooms. And, it's all about bravado and machismo and, kind of bullying each other essentially. And I'd never really been like that kind of stereotypical alpha male type of guy, the jock stereotype. I never kind of fit that mold. But I always tried to. Like I kind of felt a bit of an outsider. So I always felt like I was trying to. Like the analogy that often comes up in men's work is like wearing a mask. I definitely felt like I was wearing this mask of like trying to fit in and trying not to get teased and bullied and say the right things and really perform my masculinity in a certain way so that I fit in with all these other guys who are also performing their masculinity in a certain way. And that caused a lot of mental health issues for me. Like I was, one of the ways that I quote unquote wore that mask or performed that masculinity was through drinking. Like I was known as the Australian, dude who could hold his liquor. And so I would just booze up every weekend, and I mean, more than every weekend, most days of the week I was drinking, and to the point where it became a bit of an issue. Specifically sexuality related, there's probably a period of 5 years when I was at university and then kind of traveling afterwards where I, for 5 years probably didn't have sex once sober. Every time was under the influence. And because it was a lot of booze as well, heaps of times there was like alcohol-induced impotence, right? So like brewer's droop or whiskey dick, whatever you want to call it. Couldn't get it up because I was just too smashed. And, and I was really concerned about my performance with regards to like sex as well. Like I was very anxious about, hooking up with young women and again, performing my masculinity through like being a dominant sexual partner or a dominant male in the bedroom. And and that looking a certain way. And so because of that anxiety, I was very tense, and I experienced a lot of premature ejaculation. So I would drink to excess so that didn't happen. But then because I was drinking in excess, I ended up not being able to get an erection, but then I just blamed it on the booze. So I ended up becoming this really vicious cycle where I could use alcohol as a scapegoat for a sexual experience that kind of didn't look a certain way, so I could pass it off as it being funny to all my friends later on, and like just a story to tell, which was a very unhealthy cycle. And so that was like the first kind of big thing that I suppose made me realize that this is something that needs to be worked on. Is I recognized this in myself. I was like, holy shit, this isn't good. Something needs to change. And very serendipitously, I actually seriously injured my back. I actually fractured my lower spine. And so I was, I needed to do clinical rehab. And a part of that rehabilitation was to go to Pilates. And the Pilates instructor said I should supplement my classes with them by doing yoga. And so I was introduced to yoga. And then through yoga, I was introduced to like meditation and tantra and like mindfulness and all these other really beautiful healing modalities. And for the first time in my life, I like slowed down, man, and just like listened to my body, like really paid attention to how I was not only physically feeling, but like emotionally feeling as well. And as I started like doing these classes, there was heaps of times during a Pilates class, for example, that I was releasing tension from my body, particularly from like my hips and my pelvis and my lower back. And all this sadness and grief would come up, man. I would just like start crying halfway through a class or through a yoga class. All this anger and frustration would just bubble up from seemingly nowhere. And I would just like want to rage. And I didn't really know what was happening. I know now what was kind of happening was all these emotions that I repressed and stored in my body and not let myself experience had kind of manifested as physical tension. And as I was releasing that physical tension, the emotion that had been trapped in there was kind of starting to be felt. And so I realized, I was like, I need to, at the time I was like, I need to do something about this. I can't just have these random outbursts of emotions. It's not super healthy either. So I ended up seeing a counselor, and the counselor referred me to a psychologist. And so I just learned emotional regulation, man, like plain and simple. Just spoke to a psychologist about like how to manage my emotions, how to process them, what they meant. Also unraveling the stories behind where those emotions came from. So all my narratives and sexual scripts about being a man and all that sort of stuff. And that was a huge light bulb moment for me. I was like, holy shit, like there's like all this stuff that I'd been carrying with regards to like what it means to quote unquote be a man, and what that meant sexually. And that's where this whole like, this piece kind of dropped for me of like, I don't have to do that. I don't have to perform masculinity and sexuality this way. Like it's okay. And so I started changing, man. I started, speaking up a little bit more in the locker room, calling out some of the fellas who were my mates. Ended up losing friends because of that. I ended up having better sexual experiences because I wasn't so anxious. I was more comfortable in my own skin. I was more communicative and expressive. And I was asking these young women what they actually liked. So so the sex ended up being better. I wasn't so, I still was drinking quite a bit, but I cut back on my drinking, and that helped with, feeling more pleasure when I was having sex as well. And so I really kind of had this realization that like all this psychology stuff that I was studying and seeing a psychologist as well, working on my mental health things, like that was having a really positive impact. But then also all the body work stuff that I was doing, I was getting massages and I was meditating and I was doing yoga and I was learning about tantra. I was reading all these books. That was kind of having a really positive impact in the same kind of general direction. They were just two very different kind of ways of approaching self-transformation and self-development. So I had this idea of like, where's the middle ground between these two things? Like, why aren't these two people or these two base camps kind of communicating with one another with regards to the work that they're doing? And so that really intrigued me. And I was like, I want to explore that space. And that's where I graduated university. I was studying philosophy as well. So I was really interested in like Eastern philosophy. And I got, I just had the opportunity to travel. After I graduated, I went down to South America, for example, and experienced some plant medicine. I was able to go to Southeast Asia and India, and I was really privileged to be able to go and learn yoga over there and I ordained as a Buddhist monk in Thailand, and I was just able to explore things experientially, right? Like really firsthand learn them, which was, I was just having all these like incredible experiences. And then I also wanted to like really ground all of that I was learning, firsthand in just like, I really value like scientific, medically accurate information and education. So that kind of westernized way of thinking about higher education. So I was like, what can I study to kind of really supplement the physical experiences that I'm having and the stuff that I'm learning firsthand? And here in Western Australia, we've got a sexology degree. So I came back to Western Australia, did my sexology degree. And I suppose, man, like long story short, I guess the stuff that I put out into the world today, the education information that I put out into the world is the stuff that I needed to hear like 10, 15 years ago when I was going through all that stuff with regards to my masculinity and sexuality and mental health and drinking and all that sort of things. Like I needed someone, specifically I needed a man, right, who was maybe 10 years older than me, 15 years older than me, who knew what he was talking about, who was knowledgeable, who was compassionate, who, wasn't fucking toxic like a pickup artist guru type, coach. And so that's who I try and be today. I try and be the guy that I needed to hear from, back at that period of my life. And yeah, so that's what that looks like is as a men's sex coach. Particularly I work with people who share a lived experience with myself. So I predominantly work with cis het white dudes. That's my lived experience, and those are the guys that really seem to like connect deeply with the work that I'm sharing, because I guess I share an experience with them. But kind of beyond that, I feel like why my work has been relatively well received is because I guess regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of race or ethnicity, guys in general tend to have very similar insecurities and anxieties about their masculinity, about their sexuality, about their sexual function as well. Regardless of like the color of your skin, if you're a guy, you've probably got a dick, right? And your dick works relatively the same way across all demographics. So, I speak about premature ejaculation, for example, and it resonates with anyone who prematurely ejaculates, regardless of what they look like. So, it's been really amazing, man. And the journey's been very twisting and winding, and I didn't just go, male sex coach, that's what I'll do. It was very much like something that I took a while to really land on. And there's been different iterations of my work over the years, but I feel really good about where I've niched, and I feel really passionate about like men's sexuality and men's experiences of pleasure, and like our bodies and what we can do with our bodies, where we can take our capacity for pleasure and things like that. So, and masculinity as well, man, just like fully deconstructing masculinity has been a big part of my own journey. So that's something I try and weave into my sex ed as well, man. So yeah, that's as much of a nutshell as I could put it in. That's how I got to do the work that I'm doing today.
Wow. What a journey. And it's just blows me away that, really came through an incident, where you really seriously hurt your back. Because I often say to people, sometimes something really bad happens, and at the moment we're like, this is the worst thing that could ever happen to me, But with some perspective, some hindsight, and some forward thinking, we look back and be like, wow, that was the best thing that ever happened.
Totally, man. And you like to get esoteric here, you alchemize it, right? The pain and the suffering that you feel when you practice that, alchemy, and alchemy is a very esoteric term, but like you just learn that there's a blessing in that pain or in that suffering or in that tragedy. And that becomes your gold. You know what I mean? That becomes the thing that you, it's kind of a bit of a wounding, but that wounding then turns into this thing that you are really can use as a powerful transformative tool. So that definitely resonates for me, at least if I think about my own journey. It's like at the time I was like, I'm fucked. I'm not going to play soccer anymore. I can't walk. My physiotherapist told me don't have sex as well. And when I'd hurt my back. So all those things really at the time I thought, this is my life done. I'm a late teens, early 20s guy who's broken his back. Like, what the fuck is wrong with me? So it was, and it's definitely been something that has really informed my, my physical transformation and definitely like my my transformation with regards to masculinity and sexuality. Like that, it became my gold.
Yeah. And I feel like I could like talk back and forth between your story and the things that have occurred to me and my own journey through masculinity and traveling South America and India and so forth. Like I could probably do a whole podcast on to talking about that, because it's so true that men's experiences are so similar across the world. Like so similar. We have the same fears and concerns. But I'm actually going to go on to the topic we want to talk about, which is intimacy after childbirth, right? Because I saw that you had your little Fergus, and he's doing well, and he's growing. Yes, and I see him getting bigger and bigger, which I love to see from babies, which is so cliche because of course they get bigger and bigger, right? It's like when your auntie or some like distant relatives like, oh, I haven't seen you for 10 years, haven't you grown? You're like, what do you expect me to do, shrink? But no, it's really beautiful to see. But I thought that you'd be a perfect person to speak to, just because of the work that you do with men, and also because of your current and the experience as well. And I saw quite a few of your posts that talked about how men don't talk about childbirth and pregnancy and these things from their side very often. Like I've read a lot about women and their experience, but you don't hear that many men talk about their experience of it, because there is an experience, right? There's a huge experience for men. So I think the first thing I'm really interested in is like, what was your partner Edwina's pregnancy like for you?
Yeah. Thanks, man. Thanks for inviting me to speak about this particular topic. And yeah, I guess like my preface or my caveat for this is like, I'm just going to speak from my own experience, like, and fully acknowledge the incredible journey that pregnant women go on, and childbirth and the power in it, and that I fully will never understand it from that side. So I'm just only going to speak from my own side of things. And for me, seeing my partner, seeing Edwina go through our pregnancy journey together, like she was very sick for a lot of it. Like she had a lot of morning sickness. She had a lot of nausea. Probably for the first trimester, she was in bed 90% of the time. She like couldn't get up. We were, at the time we were living in a bus, in a school bus that we'd converted. But thankfully a friend of ours, they went on holiday and let us use their house. They've got a lovely property on a farm for that kind of first trimester. And the whole time she was just in bed, just kind of sick and spewing up regularly. Like she couldn't really eat too much. I think she was like down to like wafer crackers and orange juice. I think that's like all she could really stomach without ending up spewing it all up. And so I very much became a caretaker for the most part. Like I stepped into the role of like, I've got to take care of you. Like I had to go out to the shops and buy things for her to help her with her nausea. I was bringing her hot water bottles. I was bringing her ice packs because she was just holed up in bed, and it was an interesting dynamic because I obviously never had to do that before in our relationship, and we're about 4 years in. So that was a very drastic change in roles. Like there'd been obviously instances of where I'd been a little bit sicker under the weather or she'd been, but we'd never really like had to take care of each other in that regard. So that shift in like me being a caretaker and her being the person that I take care of, like very much killed intimacy during those first 3 months. It's, and that's like, if my analytic brain goes, well, that's a very reasonable response because you don't necessarily want to have sex with your caretaker or the person you're taking care of because that's a very parent-child relationship and yada, yada, yada. So my intellectual brain goes down that whole route. But if I think just really experientially, like I'm not attracted to a sick person. Like I don't find a sickly person very, like I don't lust after that. That doesn't make me feel aroused. So I loved taking care of Edwina because it was how I felt like I could serve her, because I knew she was going through this change in her body and things were really like happening, and we were tracking hormones and all this sort of stuff, and I was like, wow, this is like big. And so I felt like the way that I could show up was just like be in service to her by like doing these things and making her tea and yada, yada, yada. So So I didn't mind too much about like our sexual chemistry kind of taking a bit of a hit, being a bit dampened during that period. But then, things changed, I suppose. She went into the second trimester. She was still quite nauseous. The third trimester was kind of like where things turned around in terms of her, like, feeling her morning sickness or her nausea. She started like really wanting to be a bit more active, and she felt really comfortable eating a few more things and going out into the world and being able to just interact and be on her feet, which is great. It took me a little while to shift out of the kind of caretaker role a little bit. I still was like, because she was, I fully saw like the change in her body. Like, it was the third trimester. It was visibly like, oh, you're a pregnant woman. Like, you need some help, right? And that was very much like my conditioning as well. I was like, oh, I've got to help this pregnant person. Like that's a big part of like our culture and our society as well, as like, you stand up for the pregnant lady or so that was, I saw that kind of really showing in my behavior as well. I was like, no, don't pick that up. No, don't do this. And really trying to like overdo the caretaker kind of thing for her, which did create a little bit of friction, because she was like, no, I can fucking do it myself. I'm not a child, essentially, right? Going back to that kind of dynamic. So that was interesting to kind of like, oh, okay, I can take a step back here. She's a little bit more autonomous than maybe I had kind of projected onto her. So that was really great to kind of have that challenged for me personally. And so we did end up being like quite a bit more intimate. We were able to like be a lot more physically intimate, I suppose. We didn't really do that when she was quite sick and in bed, because I just didn't want to be next to a person who hadn't showered for a couple of days, because they were a bit, they just couldn't do it. So that was, and I couldn't eat food in the same room as her because it would make her sick and things like that. So I really welcomed the more physical intimacy in that kind of third trimester. I won't say though that it wasn't very sexual. It was very like intimate, and it was very pleasurable, it was very enjoyable, but it wasn't like explicitly sexual. And the reason, I suppose, for that, for me personally, was like, again, I don't really find pregnant women attractive, right? I'm not aroused by pregnancy. I'm not aroused by pregnancy. I was very in love and connected and attracted to Edwina at the time. I still am now, but her like pregnant body was something that I really wanted to hold and wanted to touch and wanted to cherish, but it wasn't something that I was like, this is a turn on for me. So I had to kind of grapple with that personally myself. And a couple of times that we did have sex, I suppose, and be sexual with one another, just the mechanics of it is all thrown, right? If she's got this kind of big belly in there, there's only so many positions that you can kind of try, and that was totally fine, but like she couldn't really be on her back, and there, so it was just anatomically, I suppose, was a little bit more challenging, and as much as we like to play around and kind of sex between us isn't very awkward, because we like to have a laugh and we just kind of like to have a bit of playfulness, but there's only so much playfulness can get you when you literally can't be in a position for a very long time. So we end up, a lot of our intimacy ended up just kind of being lying next to each other, nude, just kind of connecting, holding, caressing, touching, and just having that really, it was a lot more sensual rather than sexual is what I'll say there. So, which is totally fine, because we'd over the last 4 years spoken about shifts in the way that we connected with one another. And this was just another way of connecting or shifting the way that we connected. So I feel like we navigated it really well. Anything else that came up for me personally over pregnancy? I don't know, man. Like, there's just this like weird, like reverence, I guess, for like a pregnant woman, and just like what she's kind of going through, and just kind of being there as she goes through it. I was just like a little bit in awe, like of like her organs were changing, like she was just like the body shifts, like her ribs were moving, like it boggles my mind, literally, like the the process of growing a whole human being in a womb, plus a placenta as well, which is like a whole organ. Like, it just was super weird to me, like very surreal. Because I hadn't really put too much thought into pregnancy before we decided we wanted to conceive. And so it was very out of sight, out of mind. And then we were like fully in it. And it was just this very, it was just very reverential, I suppose. And so that, so that really shifted the way that I guess like interacted with Edwina. Again, it kind of showed up in maybe a little bit of that protector role in maybe not so healthy way, to the point that I was kind of taking autonomy away from her. And then when I kind of shifted that, it became this, I suppose like the word I can think of is like, it was like this like healthy worship. You know, I really wanted to kind of support her and kind of help in the way that she needed as well. I started to ask a lot more for what she needed, and we started to communicate a lot more about that. So it really helped with our communication in terms of like, okay, what needs do we need fulfilled, right? What's coming up for us, and what do we need to have those needs fulfilled? So it really prompted those conversations, which is really beneficial, especially now. So that's like the pregnancy, man, I suppose, in terms of like how I experienced it. And there's obviously that there's either side of those things as well. There was conception and preconception stuff, and then there's birth stuff. But the pregnancy, that kind of like 3 months, 3 3-month trimesters, that's kind of like how I experienced the pregnancy.
Wow. I can really hear the awe and the reverence, you know, like I can really, when you talk about the pregnant body, it's like as a man who can never go through that kind of transformation and experience, it just like for me, it always leaves me in this state of looking and being like, I just want to be like, just look over it, you know. I want to so I find myself even on Instagram, I see women posting pictures of themselves pregnant. Sometimes I just look and I'm like, wow. And I feel like it's very easy for us to look at a woman who's pregnant and really see a goddess, because it's like they are creating, they are in this really feminine state of creating. And as men, we look at that and be like, I can never create in that way.
Totally, man. Totally.
We can only just look and be in awe. And as you said, to be in service of. And I really love how you were talking about how it helped your communication, which I think is something that a lot of people might be quite surprised to hear.
Yeah, it was. It was surprising to us as well, like the way that it kind of showed up in me, that way of being in service, but in not such a healthy way, I guess, like from those old stories. And you know, like Edwina, because she was quite sick, she didn't work during her pregnancy, and she hasn't gone back to work either. And so another story that's kind of coming up for me now, more so, but definitely was coming up as we were kind of journeying through pregnancy together, was like the provider, the breadwinner kind of story and narrative that I had around that. And you know, like not wanting, I suppose, to perpetuate those kind of really rigid gender roles of like mother, nurturer, feminine woman, and, you know, male provider, breadwinner, money maker type, you know, those kind of very stereotypical gender roles. So I really had some resistance to working, you know, like I had some resistance to like I've got to go, like I work online, thankfully, and I work for myself, but like I didn't necessarily want to work because I was trying to challenge that stereotypical role of, you know, provider, breadwinner, kind of moneymaker. But then in terms of practicalities, like Edwina wasn't working, so I had to go to work. I had to, you know, show up for my clients, and I had to just keep on offering things. And so I still notice a little bit of this internal self-sabotage or resistance to, you know, to working or to making money. because I'm just very aware of those like really those stereotypical roles, and I don't want to fall into those roles like my parents did, or like so many of kind of our parents' generations did, and reinforce and perpetuate those things. So yeah, so that's been an interesting journey for me as well, man. Is like like embodying the provider in a kind of way that feels really positive and healthy for me, not in a way that makes me automatically think of my dad, I suppose, who I think did it in a really unhealthy way. So that's been an interesting journey as well, to be honest.
Because I think often we think of the provider, and with that comes a disconnection from the partner and from the baby. We also think of the provider like, I've been reading Fire in the Belly by Sam Keen, and he talks about fathers going off to work and working long hours and not spending time with their wives and their kids. And that's the kind of idea we have of the provider, which is, quite an extreme level of provider. And what I'm hearing from you is you're kind of embodying this provider that actually also embodies a lot of your values that came before you had to embody that archetype.
Yeah, very much so, man. And it's been like, okay, how do I bring these kind of two? Like, I really feel a lot of nurturer in me, and I'm trying not to fall into the trap of like polarizing those two things and kind of dichotomizing the nurturer and the provider, and like trying to amalgamate them, and like you can nurture by providing and things like that, and trying to like rewrite that story for myself. So yeah, it's been quite interesting actually, and like all the money stuff's coming up as well because of this, because we're a one income family now. It's my income is kind of supporting the family, which is very like totally fine and very practical, but that's a story that I've had to like really work on as well in my own kind of concept of being a man and this kind of family unit and what that kind of means. So it's just been quite interesting to see how that's shifted, and that definitely started when Edwina was pregnant, and it's now kind of really starting to I'm really starting to challenge it now, 4 months kind of into the life of our little son. So yeah, it's quite interesting actually, the whole provider archetype and reframing that for like a more modern, new age father or dad or father figure, I suppose. So yeah, can't put my finger on like where I am with it at the moment, but it's definitely been something that's been coming up for me a lot.
Sounds like there's a book in there.
Yeah, I think so, man. I think so, yeah.
Definitely does. So I know that birth is a really beautiful experience for a lot of people, right? And having the birth and things are arranged, and I know you guys planned on a home birth, if I remember rightly. And it can often feel. I remember there was a post you did, and I read it today actually. A particular, I think it was a sports commentator in the States, had talked about someone who'd taken some time off to go to his child's birth, and had kind of insinuated like, what's he going to do there? To stand and watch. And I also remember, I don't know if you know, Alan Sugar, who's like a businessman in the UK. He, in his book, I read many years ago, and the reason why I remember it is because the hospital that his first child, I think, was born is like where I went to school. It's like down the road. And he talks about literally just sitting outside the room, because at the time he wasn't allowed into the birthing room. So he just sat there for a number of hours until someone come out and goes, "Hey, your baby's born." And he's like, "Thanks." And then they walk back in. They walk back on and gotta leave him there. But I imagine now, obviously things have come a long way, but it's very easy for a man to feel like the birth is just this thing you're observing, you're not really a participant in. So, really interesting to hear what your experience was like of your birth.
Yeah, man. Thanks. I'll speak into our experience. So we had planned a home water birth, and we had a midwife and a doula supporting us, and so on the day of, Edwina started labouring, which went into very early stages of labour at around like 1-2 o'clock in the morning, and so we had everything kind of set up, and she kind of had like pre-labor contractions a couple of days before. And so we thought, this weekend or today's the day kind of like feeling. We knew it was very imminent. She was also 42 weeks for people that are familiar with the birthing journey. That's quite late, but I guess kind of to be expected for a first birth as well. So we weren't too worried, and we had a really beautiful support team. And so we're like, we've had our friends, a lot of friends in the community down here had water births, and we were very we'd done some hypnobirthing classes, and we were very prepared, I suppose, for the home birth, which is fantastic. We felt really good to go. So started setting things up real early in the morning, and I won't go through the whole birth journey, but what I will share is like it ended up being a 23-hour labor. So Edwina labored for 23 hours at home, which was very tough. It was a very tough labor, and the reason why is because it was it was a very textbook definition of obstructed labor. So Edwina, she stopped dilating at 7 centimeters, and our son Fergus, he was not directly in line with the cervix as well. He was kind of twisted into the side, and his neck was a bit crooked, so he wasn't in the greatest position, and we think that's kind of why Edwina stopped dilating. So it was just like a fucking long day of Edwina also not being able to eat or drink anything because she got quite nauseous again. So we were like really trying to get the little bits of fluid into her. So she ended up having an IV bag of fluids at the house, administered by our midwife, which was like wild. But like it was very active labor as well. We tried a lot of like spinning babies techniques to try and get Fergus in the right position. Then we tried all these other. It was like a bloody man. Honestly, it was like a workout. Like I was hurting and sweating after all like the lunging and squatting and moving and stuff that we were doing. And I was like, oh my God, I'm struggling to do this. And Edwina's fucking in labor doing this. And I was just, again, another kind of real, oh my God, like this, this amazing woman is doing this. Like, and so we've got all this like amazing video of kind of us like doing walking lunges down the hallway of our house, and her having contractions halfway through, and like really holding on to me. And it was, and so I felt very participatory in the birthing process, even though I wasn't really doing anything. I was just kind of there. I felt very much in the birthing bubble with Edwina, which was amazing. That's because that's what we wanted. We wanted to have like a really connected, both of us be a part of the, there was, so there's lots of, so there was just a big day. And so because it was obstructed labor, we ended up having to have an emergency cesarean. So emergency C-section at a hospital, which was about, normal driving, speed limit driving was an hour and 15 minutes away. We had the option of a ambulance coming from that hospital, which was an hour and 15 minutes away, to our house to then take Edwina strapped down on her back to the hospital. And we were like, no, fuck that, I'm driving. So we threw Edwina in the back of the car, and I drove with our midwife in hot pursuit, and then our doula behind her. And I got to the hospital in about 45 minutes, and copped a couple of speeding fines on the way, which was and so that was at like, because it was at, it was 23 hours of labor, so that was at like 11 o'clock at night. So thankfully there was no one really on the road, but we were just exhausted. Like, and Edwina's body, she went into transition in the car. So transition is like where your body starts to push and wants to get this baby kind of really out of you. But because she wasn't fully dilated, her body was pushing Fergus into a more and more like confined position, and so he was getting more and more squished as her body was pushing. And and she was screaming, she was howling in the back of the car. No room really to move around, and just her body going into like this, natural, like it was naturally doing what it was supposed to do, but it was just her cervix hadn't dilated fully for it to like really be effective. So that was really like, that was a heavy drive. There was, probably the whole experience, man, including like going into the hospital and having like her having another bag of IV fluids being put into her because she was throwing up, and then getting prepped for the C-section. I put my scrubs on and I was allowed to go into theatre with her. So Edwina got the epidural like 2 seconds before she got cut open, essentially.
Wow.
And they're making her sign consent forms, like quote unquote informed consent forms, when she's like already had some painkillers and like is in deep contractions and she's about to go into theater. They're like, oh, you need to sign this. And they're saying like, if there's potential risk of death and all this sort of stuff. And she's like, I just want to get it in there and get it over with. Like, just that whole sidebar of like, medical consent is just like very weird to me. So being in that space, I was like, well, that's a bit strange. Because which pregnant woman is not going to sign that consent form in that moment? It felt
How
very
can you
coercive.
not consent?
Yes,
is he not in
totally.
a position to really consent?
Yeah. So I was very much like, okay, I'm just going to park that for a conversation with someone who's a professional at a later date. But then going into theater and having her kind of blissed out because she's had the epidural. Like, I didn't have a fucking epidural. Obviously, I wasn't in any physical pain. But, bro, Edwina just like was blissed out. She was like, what's even happening? Like, oh, this is so lovely, so nice. I was there like a fucking nervous wreck, man. It was honestly that day of birth was probably the most scared I've ever been in my life. Like, it was, wow. I was terrified. The woman that I love and, our soon to be born, but, still yet unborn child, I guess like 100 years ago, man, or in a different country today, would have ended up they would have died. Both of them would have died. They would have, obstructed labor is a pretty fucked up, serious like situation when you don't have like the Western medical kind of stuff that we very luckily have. So, and you're just like, you're on that cusp of life and death, during that birthing process. There's a very real risk of death, and it was so it was just like really gnarly, man. Like, we talk a lot about holding space, as people in the men's work business. We talk a lot about like being space holders and what it means to like create a container, help people feel safe. And like, I obviously had done that work and was talking about it, very familiar with it. But that day tested me to my limits, man, of like what it meant to hold space for someone for that long, for that intense, with my own shit coming up of being afraid and being fearful and like, so it was very, it was very traumatic, man. Like, I'll definitely use the word traumatic. It was traumatic for our son. It was traumatic for Edwina, and it was traumatic for me. It was traumatic for all three of us in three different ways as well. Like the trauma was definitely shared, but it was experienced very differently by the three of us. So it was, and then, Edwina's had like a major abdominal surgery. So, and I was there, listening to, if anyone's been to a C-section, there's a lot of cutting noises and slurping noises. Wow. And I don't want to get too graphic, but it was hectic and like literally just on the other side of this little screen. And I don't do well with blood in the best of times. And so just like hearing these very, medical surgery noises, I was just very, I was very on edge. But and then it was all done, man. It was all done. She was stitched up. The whole thing took like 15, 20 minutes.
Wow.
And it was bang, bang, bang. This is an emergency. It was about 15, 20 people in this, in this theater. and it was just, very efficient, which was incredible. Like it was an amazing team. And before we knew it, I was cutting Fergus's umbilical cord. He was on my chest. He was then on Edwina's chest. We were rushed into the maternity ward. She was breastfeeding within the next, I guess 15, 20 minutes. Like she was breastfeeding, and it was all done, and it was essentially onto recovery, onto processing what the fuck had just happened. And it took us a couple of days, and we spent a few days in hospital. So just really wrap our heads around, holy shit, we had this whole planned thing for our birth. And so there was some sadness around not having that experience that we had anticipated and we had really prepped for and we'd really tried to manifest. So there was a bit of a sense of loss of not having that. There was a sense of gratitude for our little team of midwife and the doula, but also for the team of people that had really helped save Edwina's life and save Fergus's life. There was a lot of gratitude and relief for that. There was some shame for us, and not necessarily because we felt shamed by the amazing doctors and team at the hospital, but just because a lot of our friends had really amazing home births, and we, that was the community we're a part of, and we wanted to kind of be a part of that community and have this really beautiful experience to share with everyone else. And so there was a little bit of shame of having to go to hospital and not having this, and so we kind of worked through that, and just expectations, I suppose. And yes, it was just super fucking emotional, man. And so there was a lot of crying on Edwina's end. I felt like I couldn't cry, and not necessarily because not because of this story that men shouldn't cry, but I felt like I personally couldn't cry because I was still holding space for Edwina, and I was she's very raw right now. She's very vulnerable. She's very physically weak right now. She couldn't stand up. She had a catheter in. She's in a physically weak state at the moment. She just had major abdominal surgery, and I was she's not going to be able to hold me, and it's not fair on her to ask her to hold me right now. So I kept it together, essentially, and I used that word, kept it together, very intentionally, because I felt like I needed to cry. I felt like there was some things that were kind of really needing to come out, but I consciously kind of put a lid on that, to stay in hospital with her for 4 days, essentially, before we were allowed to finally come home. So yeah, the birthing process was our doula likes to say, she likes to use the word immense. It was very immense. It was a lot, and we're still 4 months on. We're still processing it, man. Still working through it, and still making sure that the things that were traumatic for us don't keep rearing their ugly heads, I suppose, and working on those triggers. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I can share at the moment, man. There's probably more there, but that's all I can really think of at the moment.
Yeah, no, man, that's a really wild experience, to to go from, you had these plans, and it was going to be, you kind of formulate these plans over quite a period of time as well, how you want it to look, how you want it to be, and then to be, almost thrust into the hospital, like you said, you did an hour, 15-minute drive in 40 minutes. It's literally like a rocket speed thrust into a completely different world, completely different world to what you were expecting. And something that you thought would happen slowly, like baby coming out slowly, you see his head coming, all those things, was kind of squished into 15, 20 minutes, so this the kind of shock of it all.
Very much so, man. And we had all these beautiful plans of having a little baby bubble where it would just be Edwina, myself, and our doula and our midwife for the first 2 weeks of Fergus's life. And that went out the fucking window because he was born and there was about 15, 20 other people in this room with him. So, and then over the 4 days that we were in hospital, he probably met another 50 people through all the midwives and the pain teams and the doctors and the cleaners and the people that brought us our food. So we were like, well, okay, never mind. So we had to like, so there's a bit of guilt as well that came up because we were like, fuck, we wanted to do this for you, Fergus. And like now, like, it was just like we were feeling really guilty that we couldn't give him that, the start that that we wanted for him. So yeah, so there's just a lot of emotions, man, a lot of emotions flying around.
Mm. Wow. And then the grieving process of not having things the way you wanted to, and an acceptance of that as well, because once you need to accept it, to move forward and to be present in what is occurring.
Totally, man. Totally. Yeah. And I think we're still cultivating that acceptance piece at the moment. And the more we talk about it, man, I think the more that helps with us accepting. And I think like it's a really important like story to share. We often hear like really beautiful birth stories and really like ones that go really smoothly. And those are really celebrated. And I think there's a bit of stigma and taboo around sharing a birth story that is a little bit more traumatic. So there's a little bit of power, I think, in just kind of reclaiming, the power of that story. So I know for Edwina, at least, she's found a lot of power in like retelling her birth story and really claiming it, and not really, she doesn't feel like she missed out on anything with regards to, the birthing process. She labored for 23 hours. Her body went into transition. She did pretty much everything up until Fergus kind of coming out of her vagina. So it was like, yeah. So like, that's something that we really take away from the experience as well. Is like, we went through it all. We pretty much did have a whole birth. It was just that kind of last, she didn't have any painkillers until 2 or so minutes before the surgery as well. So she feels very proud of like what she's done. And I feel very proud of her as well, having gone through that. There's a lot of, it's really changed the way I see her as a woman and as a mother, and her kind of going through that. Like there were some periods of time during the birthing experience where she was just like this primal, like animalistic, like the sounds that were coming out of her were just like intense and just like seeing, like I'd never seen her like that before, just in that real guttural kind of space. And like I don't think you ever see a woman like that unless you've seen a woman in the birthing. Like I don't think there's any other time that she is kind of like that. It was very, like the word that comes through is primal, man. It was just like this other person that she tapped into, and so it was like, again, man, it was like that awe and that reverence to come through. I was like, whoa, she's fucking doing this. Like it is wild. So I don't really have words to describe it, man, but it was very immense. I'll use my doula's word. It was very immense.
Yeah. Wow. It does feel very immense. Like I'm just like taking it all in for the first time, and I'm like, wow. I'm just like blown away that there was so much occurring in such a small time. Wow. Really, like, nah, I'm in awe of her, hearing this, and like the ability to shift from one person into this not completely different being, but like, because it can feel like you're seeing a different being to produce something, to do this. And this is part of, it's almost like your view of her expanded quite quickly in those moments.
Yeah, very much so, man. And there was like this, just like this feeling of like what do I fucking do as a guy? Like I'm in this space with her, and I'm like, I'm doing nothing. Like there was very much a sense of like, I have no purpose right now. Like I'm not helping in any way. Obviously, that's not the case. I was definitely helping, and Edwina, has shared with me that how much she felt that I was helping. But like my internal dialogue, my internal story was like, you are nothing. You're fucking doing shit all here, man. Like this woman's going through this whole birthing experience, and you're just like, good job, babe. Like, well done. Keep it up. Like, I'll hold your hand. And I just felt like, well, this is, I'll never have to do this. And it was just this very like intense realization of like, yeah, this is something that she's doing, and you're just kind of there along for the ride for the most part. So so that was a you know, a very humbling moment to be like, well, I'm just here right in this space, and this is kind of something that she's really creating. So yeah, I don't know how else to put that into words of just being like really humbled by it.
I guess in those moments, all you can do is be there, and just be present in whatever way the moment calls for you to be.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what I learned, man. Is like that space holder kind of role, I guess, was like just be there, just be present, just be like tuned in. What does she need in this moment? She couldn't ask for things, right? She was in this whole process, so just remembering to like give her a drink of water, or just remembering to like, we spoke about all these things that I know that she enjoys, like having a cool towel on her back or things like that. And I was just like, I can tune into like, does she feel a bit warm? That, has it been a while since she's had a drink? Like just things of doing like, okay, how can I be supportive here? How can I show up and be really present with what she's going through? That was definitely and doing that for like 23 hours was tough. So it was, it's just a test of presence, man, test of space holding for sure.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Incredible work. Wow. Yeah. Wow. I'm in awe. I'm starting to like think about my own future experiences as well. So this has been incredibly educational for me. So thank you so much for sharing this. I'm sure it is for the people listening as well. So we touched on intimacy a little bit during pregnancy, and I think this is something a lot of men fear. I've talked to a few of my friends who, when their wives are pregnant, and never actually talked about it afterwards, right? They're like, and there's a kind of a myth, an idea that soon as a baby's born, all sexual intimacy disappears out the window, but also that physical intimacy switches from being with the two of you as a couple to the woman and the baby. So I'm really interested to hear, what because there's also, I know you've got your personal experience, but also I imagine through your clients you've worked with, there's also an experience you've had through them as well. But I'd love to hear, the varying degrees of experience and what comes up for you.
Yeah, man. Well, whenever I think of like very prominent cliches in society, I always think that there's a nugget of truth in them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be cliches. You know what I mean? They wouldn't have just sprung out of nowhere. There's like a reason for them. And so those cliches of like, having a kid kind of kills your sex life. Like there's a nugget of truth in there, and I guess if I reflect on my own experience with Edwina, like Fergus for the first 3 months of his life has had colic, right? He's been just a crying, uncomfortable mess of a little dude, and he's just needed soothing. He's just needed, he needed to be breastfed, or he's needed to be held, right? And like so on a emotional level, that's quite a lot to have a baby who's crying several hours a day. Like just imagine a little person screaming in your ear for a couple of hours each day. It's like, that's emotionally a lot. It's quite draining. Like energetically as well, not even like in an esoteric sense, but just like in a physical, energetic sense as well. Like Edwina is like, she was breastfeeding all day. So that like, and breastfeeding consumes a lot of like calories and just physical energy. So she was just like, she was physically drained as well. And like feeling quite touched out as well. She just had a person on her all the time. So, whenever I took Fergus, that was like the only time that she would just be kind of by herself and enjoy not being touched. And so, that was a bit of a challenge for us, was to navigate like that physical intimacy space, which was such a huge part of our life before Fergus was born, to now there just being this little human in between us pretty much all the time. Like if I'm not holding him, then Edwina's holding him. If Edwina's holding him, whatever. So there's just no, now it's getting better in this fourth in this 4th month of his life, he's feeling more comfortable being put down, and he's sleeping off us on occasion. So there's been some times where we're able to connect a bit more and kind of bring a little bit of that intimacy back, physical intimacy. But the first 3 months, man, it was just pretty much out the window. So there's a little bit of truth in those cliches, I feel like. Just from a purely pragmatic, practical sense, there's truth in them, because you do have this little human being, or at least in our case, we had a little human being who just needed to be in between us. The other thing, man, was like, Edwina's body she had major abdominal surgery. So for the first 6 weeks, she wasn't allowed to like push a pram up a hill. She wasn't allowed to really go for too much of a walk. Like there was just like limitations to her physical capabilities and what she could and could not do. And so although she didn't have like a vaginal birth, so everything was like still, I hate the word intact, but like, she hadn't had any vaginal trauma, I suppose, from the birth. She was still sore, man. She was like, she was hurting. Like her body was sore. And so like being sexual and being intimate, we did have a couple of moments over the first 3 months when actually some friends took Fergus for a couple of hours. So leaning on community has been a really positive thing for us to experience as well, is like really tapping into the community we've got. But like the way we had sex really had to shift. It was very tender. It was very slow. It wasn't super penetrative. It shifted from the way that we maybe had been having sex before she was pregnant, I guess. So that had to be really, like, we had to be really mindful around that. What else can I specifically speak into with regards to intimacy? Something that's popped up more recently as well is maybe a feeling of, I don't know, resentment is the word that kind of comes to mind. I don't know if that's specifically describing what it is, but to give you context, it's like I go to work and I spend a couple of hours in my office, and I don't have to. This sounds so terrible, but I don't have to deal with Fergus, right? If he's upset, or if he's cranky, or if he needs to feed, if I'm at work for a couple of hours, I'm at work for a couple of hours. I don't have to fucking manage him. And so when I finish work and I come and tune in and drop into Edwina's space, she's like the energy that I kind of get from her is like, you've had it easy for like the last couple of hours, and I've had to I've had to play with our son, I've had to feed him, I've had to change him, I've got to she's fully that caretaker role. So I pick up on a bit of that energy. So I try and drop in, be present, and give her some space, and take him for a little while. Then Edwina gets anxious that she's not taking care of him. Right, there's that really strong attachment to that kind of called the 4th trimester, I suppose, which is that first 3 months of a baby's life, and they're still very much connected. And so I'm trying to do the right thing, and what I think is the right thing anyway, of like taking him for an hour or so to kind of give Edwina a bit of space so she can drop into herself, maybe do some self-pleasuring, or just do whatever it is that she needs to fill her own cup up. But she can't really, or she finds it difficult to switch off when she's by herself, and I've got him. And so that, just be a bit kind of, and it just kind of builds, man. It builds that, like, this feeling of tension, or this feeling of frustration, or this feeling of, maybe resentment's the word I'm kind of feeling into here. And so we had to, like, a few times kind of really diffuse that, just by having conversations. And you have to strategically plan your conversations as well, because it's quite difficult to be present in a conversation with a crying baby, or with a baby that really needs attention to be played with if he's kind of making noises. So having a conversation is, and setting aside time to really intentionally drop into that conversation has also been something we've had to really strategically plan out, when we could just we could very easily do that without a kid. And now it's like, okay, we've got to manage our time around Fergus, with regards to like when we can do things like that. So that's been challenging as well, with regards to communicating. So yeah, I mean, it's been in terms of my own experience, the 4 months, like I'll be totally upfront, and Edwina won't mind me sharing this. We've only really had sex like a couple of times, and that's penetrative sex. We've found time to be kind of intimate and just kind of hold one another, but we some rituals that we like to keep is we like to have showers together. So we still have showers together in the morning. We do like a little gratitude practice in the shower. We have like a couple of minutes that we can spend just kind of touching each other and having having a bit of that physical closeness. It's getting better now at night because Fergus is now sleeping kind of off Edwina at moments. I don't want to give the impression that he's fully off her, because he's certainly not. But in those moments, Edwina kind of comes out of the room and we have a bit of a dance together. We quite like to put a bit of music on and do some dancing. So that's been really nice. And so we're just finding ways of still filling up our intimacy cup that maybe doesn't look explicitly sexual. And it's been okay for us. Like, again, I think I said this about an hour ago on our podcast, when I was saying we've learned how to navigate spaces together with regards to, like, we don't expect sex to look a certain way and happen a certain amount of times each week. It's never really been that for us in our relationship. It's always been like flowing and dynamic and changing as things change. And we don't have all these expectations about what sex should look like or how many times you should be having it and things like that. So it's been really great that we've been able to kind of navigate those spaces together. Because I think if we hadn't done a lot of that work, then we'd be having a lot more issues now. And I think maybe that's where, like, although there's a lot of truth in those cliches, and I think if I reflect on like some of the clients that I've worked with who have got kids and are struggling with their sex lives, it's because there is a lot of these expectations that sex should stay the same, or that sex has to look a certain way, or all these kind of stories that we have around sexuality, and for a lot of guys that I talk to, that's wrapped up in their masculinity as well. If they're not having sex a certain amount of times a week, then they think something's wrong with them, right? They're not man enough, or they haven't learnt how to, no one's really told them how to like cultivate a really strong self-pleasure practice. So if they do, masturbate, they don't really feel fulfilled by it. As opposed to myself, like I really enjoy my self-pleasure practice. I've really dialed it into something that I quite enjoy, and though I don't get to do it too often, the times that I do, my self-pleasure practice, I do feel filled up, and I do feel like I bring that into our relationship rather than kind of having masturbation framed as something that's really deleterious and depleting. So I think if I reflect on like some clients who are in either similar situations to myself or have been in their life, then that's something that I notice is like, is things change, man, and you've got to like be open to that, and how can you navigate that, and how can you have these conversations, and what can you do to broaden your perspective of intimacy and sex and physical connection with your partner. What are some other things you can do to fill your cup up? That's often a conversation that I tend to have with guys in general, but definitely specifically for guys that have got kids.
Beautiful. And what I'm really hearing is that, though the sexual intimacy has changed, maybe is on a certain part of the wave, that you have maintained physical intimacy in touch in the ways that are important to the two of you, like you said, the morning showers, the little dancing. And like, I can imagine even that there is still plenty of physical touch that happens between the two of you throughout the day. So you're feeling that connection between the two of you.
Yeah, very much so. We're very affectionate. I think both of our love languages is like touch, physical intimacy. So we find times to either sit on the couch together with Fergus in between us and just kind of have like a little family hug session, or whether it's, whenever we walk, we're usually holding hands when we walk, or we're standing quite next to each other. So there's a lot of like physical touch, which has been really great actually. Even though there's been points where Edwina's felt touched out, it's offered up an opportunity to like really tune in with that as well, and like start to ask, like, because it just used to be second nature that, I'd come up and give her a hug from behind, or, whatever it is. And I didn't really put too much thought into it. And it's kind of like started to like let me reflect on, like, even consent, I suppose, is like, like asking her, like, do you feel touched out? Can I give you a hug right now? Or is that going to set you over the edge and be uncomfortable for you? So even consent within like physical touch in a relationship is right, where things can get really taken for granted, of like, oh, this is my partner. Of course they're going to want a hug from behind while they're washing the dishes, because we do it all the time. But now that I know she's can feel quite touched out at times, I'm like, hey, I'd love to give you a hug. How do you feel? How are you feeling? Are you ready for a hug? And she might turn around, and she has turned around and been like, yeah, no, I just need a bit of space at the moment. Just go sit on the couch or something. And I'm like, yeah, cool, no worries. And there's been other times she's like, yeah, I really need a hug. And so it's opened up that kind of deepening for talking about consent and asking for permission and things like that in the relationship with regards to touch and having our needs met and having our boundaries respected as well.
It's a real, like, a lot of learning, a lot of letting go of how things should be, or how things maybe used to be, like, and just like being in what's there now and navigating that and being quite present to that as well. As I'm hearing you saying, it's because, as you said, like, a lot of people get really tied up with, this is how things were, so things need to still be the same. And if they're not the same, maybe someone's going to be unhappy. But what I'm hearing with the two of you is there's a lot of communication, there's a lot of emotional intimacy, because you're having a lot of communication and talking about what you're feeling. And that's allowed you to probably navigate past some of the kind of assumptions, or not have those assumptions, but also come to a place where it's deepened the level of communication, your deeper level of understanding, and even like even more respect for each other as well.
Yeah, I think so, man. I think there's like a, just because like, we're fulfilling different roles now in our life, like, where she's a mother, I'm a father, like we have a kid, like this is a whole another human being that we're now responsible for. So like, in terms of, we keep joking like, oh, when's a real adult going to come and take our child away from us? But there is like this sense of transitioning into a different role. Like, I don't want to call it a more mature role, because there's people out there that won't have kids or don't have kids, and I don't want to say that that's not mature, but it's definitely like this, for us at least, our personal experience is like this deepening of our own understanding about who we are as people. Like, Fergus has been a fucking huge mirror and trigger for a lot of our stories, particularly from childhood, that's been like popping up for us. And so, I've done a bit of inner child work, in my life. It's not something I teach, but, this is the most profound inner child work I've done, just by having a relationship with a child, with my own child. And yeah, it's just been, this real big deepening experience, I suppose, deepening and opening, and just surrendering into that, man, and not trying to fight it. I think there was a little bit of, I was saying before, that holding on sensation. I was just trying to like keep things together. I think and something that's been happening over, the last 24 hours, 48 hours is letting go of that, I suppose, letting go of like thinking that I need to keep it together, and just surrendering into, asking for help, or asking for some support or some resources, or just someone to kind of talk to, and realizing that, quote unquote, keeping it together was necessary at the time, but now it's time to let go of that. And so, yeah, like surrendering into that has been a big shift for for me over the last kind of month or so, and for Edwina as well, kind of surrendering into, you know, the toughness. It's you know, hard. It's not bad, right? There's something that I reflect on as well. Like parenting's hard, but hard doesn't mean bad, and that's something we've been really resonating with as well.
And that kind of keeping it together is such a kind of masculine story that we have, isn't it? That we are told that as men we have to be strong, we have to keep it together, especially when there is, especially then when we're with a woman and she's feeling a difficult time or feeling weak, that we feel that we have to keep it together to hold everything together. And it is, you know, as you said, like to surrender to like, oh shit, like I'm also struggling. This is hard for me too. I need some help. I need, you know, I don't have it. I don't know everything. I don't know how to do all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And part of that story is like what I was sharing before during birth is like, I'm not breastfeeding. I'm not, you know, having to take care of Fergus for a couple of hours. Yes, I'm at work. Yeah, but like yeah, it's not like, it shouldn't be hard for me. Is like a story that's definitely come up is like get over it kind of to myself. Like you have it easy. You've got the easy job, in terms of like parenting. So that's definitely something that I'm working through at the moment and just processing for myself. And so part of that has just been like letting go of that keeping it together unhealthy kind of mindset at the moment. So yeah, that's where I'm at, man. That's where I've been the last 24 hours is kind of deep in that process.
Wow. There's so much like it's been, I'm just like, you know, going through everything you've said, and it's just like there's so much there. There's so much learning. There's so much like self-inquiry and new learning being done like in real time for you know. You know, it's really, and almost the words that come to me is like in really real time, because it's not that you can kind of take yourself away and go, okay, I'm going to go and meditate for 2 hours and I'm going to walk through the bush and see how I feel, because you've also got, you know, a partner and a child. So you're like processing these things while, you know, really in it.
Yeah, totally, man. There's no real opportunity to go out and deconstruct it and, you know, and go through a whole big thing. So it's been, yeah, you on the fly, learning how to regulate and manage and process and express and release, as we're, like you said, in really real time, like literally as we're kind of, things are coming up, we've got to be like, okay, cool, this has come up. Do we process this right now? Can we deal with it? Or do we have to go on to tend to Fergus? Can we put this on the back burner until later tonight and just like really lean on the communication skills that we've built over the last 5 years?
So much growth. That's what I'm really hearing. There's like a lot of growing happening in a very fast pace.
It's a cauldron, you know, like this kind of pressure cooker scenario that I feel is like is happening, and you know, things are starting to even out, I suppose. It definitely felt like it was this pressure cooker for the first 3 months, and we were just like, you're just thrown into it, man. If you've never had a kid before, or if you've never like been around a lot of parents, which we hadn't, you know, we was prepared as we can, but you know, we've never lived with a newborn before. Like Edwina's never had to breastfeed before, so like there's only so much you can learn from reading books, and there's only so much you can prepare from, you know, talking to other mums and parents. But yeah, it was just like a baptism of fire, you know, like this little person's like here to stay, and all this stuff's coming up, and you gotta handle it. So yeah, it's definitely been a journey, man, and it's only going to continue to be a journey now that I'm actually, you know, really heeding the advice of other parents. Everyone keeps saying it's, you know, it's a journey. It'll keep changing. It'll keep testing you in new and interesting and different ways. And so I'm just like, okay, cool. Really taking note of what other parents are saying who have got, you know, kids that are a couple years older, or even, you know, 10, 20 years older than what Fergus is now. And just like appreciating the fact that it's just going to keep on triggering us in new ways. And can we just appreciate that for the growth that it's going to allow us to have?
Yeah. Wow. Wow, Cam, I'm just so grateful that you shared all this here, because it's such a, so much to the story. So it's such a big, immense, use a word that you do use, immense. It's such an immense story and an immense unfolding for you. And I just feel really privileged to hear this and be, present to holding this space for you to share with everyone so openly, so honestly, so vulnerably. Because I think, like we said at the beginning, it's so rare that you hear men share from this space about the birth, the pregnancy, and the after times so openly.
Yeah, I appreciate you, man. I appreciate you asking me, and giving me a opportunity to share as well. It's kind of the first time that I have, actually. So yeah, I appreciate you listening and going over time and just being a space holder for me during this, dude. I've got a lot of gratitude.
Thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. So, if there's any listeners here and they want to find out more about you and the amazing work that you do with men and in your coaching work, where's the best place for them to kind of find you and hear you?
Yeah, well, you alluded to my Instagram earlier, so I'll drop my Instagram handle, which is at the Cam Fraser. And like I said when I was sharing about what spurred on my work, is I try and share stuff that is relevant and factual and kind of blends scientifically validated, medically accurate info with esoteric teachings from mystery traditions. And so my little my little kind of elevator pitch for my Instagram is if you go on there, you'll learn something new. So I guarantee that if you click on a random post, that you'll learn something new. That's kind of the way that I frame the social media page. And if people want to jump onto my website to check out any more of my, I've got courses or one-on-one work and things like that. My website is cam-fraser.com. And just tune in. If there's dads listening, they want to send me a message, they're more than welcome to. I'm not a super experienced dad, but I'm open to connecting with more fathers because it's now a big, obviously, part of my life. So I'm open to any dads that want to reach out.
Awesome. And you also have a wonderful podcast.
Oh yeah, I didn't even plug my own podcast, which you've been an amazing guest on. Our episode is hopefully going to get released soon. Called the Men, Sex and Pleasure Podcast. Thank you for reminding me that I actually host a podcast as well. Yeah, so listen to that as well, people.
Awesome. I know I'm also guilty of that. When I have to talk on podcasts, I forget my own one. It's so easy to do. But yeah, so listeners, I'm super grateful for this conversation. This is one of those conversations when I say really do go and share this with someone, because there's going to be someone who could do with listening to this maybe before they're having a baby, while they're in it, just so that they have more of an understanding. And also hearing a man's point of view will go such a long way for a lot of people. So, share, let us know, let me or Cam know what you think as well and how this has touched you, because I think we'd both be really interested in hearing from you.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love some feedback, man. Thank you for that call to action.
Awesome. And I say a big thank you to Cam, and a big thank you for all of you for listening. Until next week. Ciao, ciao.